building up another layer. Here we go.
Welcome back to Dwarf Fortress. My name is Caleb Bonet, and we're in Riverstopped, a dwarven mega project on the eastern hills and dunes of our world. If you didn't see my last DF video, no worries. Riverstopped is a massive dam built at the foot of a waterfall, and when we left off last time, the reservoir was only half full. It felt kind of wrong to show it off in that state, so today, we're gonna fill it up. I actually found some old footage of the first day that the reservoir was flooded. We waited until winter to mine out the ice from the river, then we put some floodgates down there. When the river finally unfroze in the spring, it immediately started overflowing its banks. This was in year 64, and I had no idea exactly how long it would take to fill, just that the reservoir was very big. If any of you future dwarven scientists are curious, here we are 4 years later, and 4 Z levels higher. It turns out when water of any depth 2 or higher freezes, it becomes an ice wall, which will then thaw out at a depth of 7, giving you a free boost of water in your reservoir each spring. Without this weird bug-slash feature, I estimate it would have taken maybe like 5 times longer to fill, maybe more, because the amount of 1-depth tiles that evaporate each summer is really significant. It was only a matter of time before the reservoir was filled, so I could focus on more important things, like
How do I make these fucking stupid assholes happy?
Ah yes, the real stupid dwarf trick is actually keeping a fortress alive long enough to realize your dream. I have to thank DF Hack's Suspend Manager from saving me from going insane, and allowing me to just build 1-wide walls without worrying whether dwarves would place blocks in their proper order. Part of my new happiness prescription involved flooding the fortress with domestically made instruments and clothing, giving my dwarves an opportunity to craft and dump their old clothes. I found out there's a DF Hack script for this too, actually. You might have already noticed, but the 2 graveyards at Riverstopped are already not small at all. We suffered a few mega beast attacks early on, thankfully nothing we couldn't handle. We also suffered more than a few construction failures. Even with DF Hack's help, the bridges that connect the central tower to the edges of the reservoir definitely fell a couple times. In the 2nd or 3rd year of the fort, we also chopped down most of the trees in the area and lost a few dwarves there. Savage wildlife, tantrums, and straight up old age took the rest. Mega projects aren't necessarily for players who like tidy and happy forts. We were also attacked by goblins a lot. At this early stage, dropping them in the reservoir wasn't super viable because they could get stuck in a tree or even some dry land. But we had steel arms, and most of my dwarves wanted a fight. The first few attacks were small, but they started to send trained rangers in metal armor routinely, and these fights were much bloodier. Doing this was sort of nice though, because we could wear goblin-sized clothing, and some of the dwarves found exotic bits of leather that they could take for themselves. Everything else we'd just melt down. On the subject of happy dwarves, I did something I don't usually do. I built a prison, complete with iron chains. Any dwarf who beat another in a tantrum would go straight here. The prison was also a tavern and a temple, so imprisoned dwarves could spend time praying, drinking, eating, or even socializing with their fellow dwarves, since I couldn't really figure out a way to keep them from enjoying the tavern/temple as well. This was a double-edged sword. Sometimes imprisoned dwarves would make a new friend, and sometimes they would just beat them to death. One crisp autumn morning, I decided to test out the defense bridges. I waited for goblins to begin crossing, then dropped them. The timing was tough. I could have locked a dwarf in with the levers, but with such an impregnable system, it feels more fun to just leave the timing to chance. Goblins who make it across never make it very far anyway. As the years pushed on, the topmost layers of the reservoir were beginning to fill out. Fallen trees were swept up in the rush of water, a reminder of why swimming is such an essential skill for an adventure mode character. The bottom of the reservoir, meanwhile, was beginning to amass body parts and skeletons from drowned goblins. Maybe someday we'd drain this thing back out and collect all the loot from past battles. It's worth mentioning that at some point I'd given the mayor of Riverstopped the name of his own, Island Rock. He was a down-to-earth craftsman, a worshipper of Id Crestboulder, the Tower of Amethysts, the female dwarf god of mountains, and seemed well liked by most of the fort. Sadly, after his tragic murder by a tantruming dwarf who spent most of the subsequent year in prison, Island Rock was succeeded by the highest member of the temple to Id Crestboulder, Ustuth Kubek Enkos. Although laden with half a minecart full of trauma, he also has a shockingly profound feel for social relationships. The water in the reservoir was almost at its final level. When I used Stone Sense, I could see the waves lapping over the tops of trees in 3D. This is a tool I've been remiss for not using so far, and I'll try to use it more in some future videos, whenever those are. And no fortress can be perfect. I know mine are messy, but I really like the look of metal furniture, so maybe in my next fort, I'll stick to a metal theme instead of all this patchy, random rock stuff. I always let the dwarves do what they want to satisfy their needs, but my decorations could be orderly as well as eclectic. But anyway, let's answer the big question. How well do the floodgates work? Can you actually drown an army by letting loose a bunch of water on them? Well, maybe somewhere else you could, somewhere designed to do that, but the last time I showed off this fort, I mentioned that it's mostly designed like a moat, not a trap per se. It can be drained off extremely quickly, as you're seeing, but it really needed to be relegated to a smaller section of the map. The water flows so quickly that the game slows to 0 FPS while it does calculations, even making time lapses difficult to film. Water just isn't meant to do this in Dwarf Fortress per se, and besides that, I haven't really taken any steps to optimize it at all. A drowning chamber only 1 Z level high would have been perfect. And obviously, the water just flows off the edge of the map. A sealed chamber would basically instantly fill, and we wouldn't be stuck waiting for 100,000 tiles of water to drain off. After the gates closed, the confused goblins had basically just gotten a bath, while inside the reservoir, clouds of mist were dissipating from the miracle of physics that had just occurred. But this was only a test, for science. It was getting pretty easy to drop the goblins into the reservoir by now, and it wasn't worth wasting the well-needed water to wash the wafting waistcoats of some filthy fucking goblins. One spring, the reservoir thawed at its final Z level, the gaps filled in, and finally, it was full. The Electrum Bridge that used to look out over a waterfall and a vast valley, then the empty pit of Riverstopped, surrounded by a gabbro wall, now overlooks a gigantic lake, with a tower and the bridges of Riverstopped growing up from below. If you dare to enter the fortress, you may encounter the fearsome arms and armies of the closed hall. You may drown at the bottom of a lake, or burn at the bottom of a magma spout, which I barely mentioned at all in this playthrough, funny enough, or you may meet your fate on the bare metal floor of the giant happy dwarf face, submerged below the surface of Riverstopped.